Hey everyone, welcome back to DarkVerse. I'm Isaac Nightshade, and tonight I've got a terrifying story for you. The babysitter who vanished without a trace. It starts with a 16-year-old girl who takes a seemingly easy babysitting job in a grand old Victorian house on the edge of town. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, assure her that their daughter Lily is quiet but sweet, and it seems like a simple gig. But as soon as she steps into the house, a cold breeze and an eerie atmosphere set the tone for a night that will soon spiral into something far darker. Lily is sweet, but she's also distant, her eyes constantly darting around as if she's watching something or someone. And when the babysitter hears whispers in the dark and finds a locked door she's warned not to open, she begins to realize that there's more to this house than meets the eye. By the end of the night, Lily disappears without a trace, and the babysitter is left questioning everything she thought she knew about the house and the terror lurking inside. I remember the first time I saw the house. The moment my eyes settled on it, something in me hesitated. It was one of those massive old Victorian houses you'd only ever see in movies. It sat perched on the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown trees and thick tangled vines. The kind of house that looked like it belonged to another time. Ancient and weathered, but somehow still standing strong, almost as if it had been watching the town for longer than any of its inhabitants had been alive. The sun was already dipping low when I pulled up in front of it, casting long, heavy shadows across the overgrown lawn. The driveway cracked under the weight of time and neglect, leading up to an ornate front door framed by a pair of giant columns. I swallowed the knot of unease in my throat. At 16, babysitting wasn't just a way to make extra money. It was a chance to feel like I was growing up, like I was stepping into the world of responsibility. And the Caldwells had been so kind, so polite on the phone. They assured me Lily would be easy to watch, that she was a sweet, quiet girl. It was just an evening job, they said. What could go wrong? I rang the doorbell, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Caldwell, tall, elegant, and with a smile that seemed just a little too tight around the edges. She introduced herself warmly, but there was something about her eyes, a flicker of something unreadable. "Thank you so much for coming, dear," she said, her voice light but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She invited me in, stepping aside to reveal the sprawling hallway behind her. The interior of the house was just as imposing as the outside, grandiose but aged. The dark wood floors creaked beneath my feet as I followed her into the sitting room. Large portraits of unfamiliar people lined the walls, their painted eyes seemingly tracking my every move. "You must be wondering about the house," Mrs. Caldwell said, almost reading my mind. "It's quite old. My husband and I have lived here for years, and we've decided to hold on to its history." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I could tell by her tone that there was more she wasn't saying, but I wasn't here to pry. Just do the job and go home. She led me upstairs to where Lily was waiting. The hallway was dark, the air thick and heavy as we passed through. I didn't know if it was the weight of the house itself or the creeping feeling that something was wrong, but I felt my pulse quicken. Lily was sitting on a large, floral-patterned armchair, a book in her hands. She looked up when we entered, her pale face expressionless. There was something strange about her gaze, vacant, distant. But then she smiled, a small, polite thing. "Hello," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm Lily." I returned the smile, though I felt a tightness in my chest. She was just a kid, right? A quiet, sweet girl, but the way she sat there, staring at me like she was studying me, it unnerved me more than I cared to admit. Mrs. Caldwell left us alone shortly after, and I was left to settle in. I tried to engage Lily in conversation, asking her about school or her hobbies, but she only answered in short, flat sentences. I could feel the silence hanging between us, thick and suffocating. That's when I noticed the temperature change. It wasn't sudden, but I could feel the coolness seep into the room, creeping up my arms like icy fingers. I looked at the windows, but they were shut tight. No draft. It didn't make sense. "Are you cold?" I asked Lily, hoping it was just me being paranoid. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then in that same soft voice, she whispered, "He's here." I froze. "Who?" But Lily just smiled, her eyes flickering toward the window. "He's always watching." I didn't know what to say. Was this just a child's imagination running wild? Or was there something else at play here? I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was nothing more than her being a little eccentric. Maybe she was lonely or scared of the dark. Maybe the house was too big and too quiet for her, and her mind was just filling in the gaps. But that cold feeling stayed with me. It was like a weight on my chest, pressing in, suffocating. I tried to focus on Lily to keep things normal. "Do you want to watch a movie?" I asked, hoping it might distract her and myself from whatever was lurking in the air. She nodded, still silent, and we settled onto the couch in front of the TV. The old television flickered to life, casting strange, muted shadows on the walls. I found myself glancing nervously at the hallway, where the darkness seemed to stretch out like a living thing, pulsing, breathing. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees, and I could hear the faintest creak from somewhere, upstairs. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft, barely audible, but it came from the hallway. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest as I strained to hear it again. It was a low murmur, a voice I couldn't place. I turned to Lily, but she didn't seem to have noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her expression blank. I stood up slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor as I crept toward the hallway. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Every footstep echoed. The whisper came again, louder this time, and unmistakable. "Leave! Now!" My skin went cold, a chill crawling up my spine. I stepped back into the room, eyes wide, but Lily didn't move. She hadn't even flinched. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run out of that house and never look back. But something rooted me to the spot. I couldn't explain it. Some part of me was drawn to that voice, compelled to understand it. But as I turned back toward the hallway, I realized something. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. I could see a sliver of darkness through the crack, the air beyond it thick and oppressive. Without thinking, I walked toward it, my hand reaching for the door handle. But before I could touch it, a cold gust of wind slammed the door shut, so violently that it shook the walls. I jumped back, heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Lily!" I called out, my voice shaky. But when I looked back at her, she was no longer sitting on the couch. She was standing in the doorway to the hallway, her eyes wide and distant, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice strange and hollow. I wanted to scream, to run, but something in her voice held me in place. It wasn't her anymore. The girl I had been talking to, the girl who seemed so quiet, so innocent, was gone. And in her place, something else was staring back at me. The cold breeze hit me again, and this time I could hear footsteps, heavy, dragging footsteps coming closer, growing louder, filling the house with an oppressive weight. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot as the darkness in the hallway deepened, swallowing everything in its path. And then, in the darkness, a figure appeared. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face, I couldn't make out the details, but I could see its eyes, those black, hollow eyes. They were staring straight at me, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't supposed to be there. "Run," Lily whispered, her voice barely a breath in the cold air. "He's coming." Lily sat at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in front of her as I worked to prepare her dinner. The kitchen, despite its size, felt cramped, like the walls were slowly closing in, pressing in from all sides. The old wood beams above my head groaned with every movement I made, and the faded tiles on the floor seemed to shift under my feet, as if the house itself was subtly shifting, realigning, watching. I forced the feeling away, focusing instead on the task at hand. I had a job to do, after all. "Is spaghetti okay?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Lily nodded. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, like she was acknowledging me without really acknowledging me. Her eyes, however, never seemed to meet mine directly. They kept flicking toward the corners of the room, then back to her hands, then to the shadows behind me. It was subtle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching something. No, waiting for something. Or someone. I couldn't quite place it, but something about her felt off. Maybe it was the way she moved, almost too carefully, as though she was afraid to disturb something invisible. She never seemed fully present in the moment, always distracted, always waiting for something to happen. I stirred the pasta, the soft bubbling sound of the water in the pot filling the silence. I glanced over at her once more, hoping to ease the tension between us, maybe find some kind of connection. "So, what do you like to do for fun?" I asked. Her lips parted, and for a second I thought she might answer. But then she just blinked, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room again. The expression on her face was distant, as though she hadn't heard me at all. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "Lily," I asked again, my voice tentative, "do you like to draw? Or play with toys? Anything?" She didn't respond for a long time. Instead, she turned her head toward the wall. And that's when I saw it, the way her fingers twitched, like she was counting something. I wasn't sure if it was the dim lighting or the way she was positioned, but it almost looked like she was counting the shadows on the wall, or worse, waiting for them to move. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. "All right, dinner's almost ready." I tried to focus on the meal, setting the table and arranging her plate. But when I turned back toward her, something about the way she was looking at the corner of the room made my stomach twist. It was as if she wasn't even aware I was there anymore. She was staring, eyes wide, unblinking, fixated on the empty space in the corner, like she was waiting for something to materialize. I felt a sudden chill in the air, cold and thick, the kind that crawls under your skin. I turned away quickly, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just Lily that made my skin crawl now. It was the house itself, the strange presence in the air that seemed to hover just beyond my reach. I filled a glass with water, trying to steady my hands, but even the simple act of filling the glass felt off. Like the room was pulling at me, warping the space around me. My fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, sending a shock of cold through my spine. I froze for a second, staring at the ripples in the water as the glass filled. It wasn't the sound that made me pause. It was the silence that followed it. There was a quiet whisper, almost imperceptible, like someone was speaking through while I looked at Lily, her small face still turned toward the corner, her lips barely moving. "He's coming back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words drifted through the air like smoke, curling around the room and settling into the spaces between us. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes locked on hers, but she didn't even seem to notice me. She was still staring, that same distant look in her eyes. "He's coming back," she repeated. And then, just as suddenly, she smiled. A soft, eerie smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I could feel my pulse quicken. My hand gripped the edge of the counter as I fought to maintain some semblance of composure. "What do you mean, Lily?" I asked, my voice trembling just a little more than I wanted it to. I took a step toward her, trying to break the tension that was hanging thick in the air. But Lily didn't respond. She just kept staring, eyes locked on the shadows in the corner, a faint smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to demand answers. But something stopped me. Something about her expression, the way her lips trembled, as if she knew something I didn't. Something about her stillness made my bones ache with fear. I swallowed hard and forced a smile, though it felt strained, false. "I think dinner's ready," I said, hoping the change in subject would pull her back to reality. But she didn't respond. I set the water glass down on the table and walked over to the small television in the living room, flicking it on. The static buzzed loudly for a moment before the screen settled into something more familiar. I turned the volume down low, trying to focus on anything but the strange, oppressive silence in the room. Lily didn't move. She just kept staring. A low, guttural groan echoed from somewhere deep within the house, At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but it felt too deliberate. The walls creaked again, louder this time, and then a faint, scraping sound came from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of something or someone dragging itself across the floor. I glanced toward the hallway. The air felt denser now, like it was heavy with something unsaid, something hidden in the spaces between the walls. I turned back to Lily, hoping she hadn't heard it, but her eyes were still fixed on the same spot. She didn't seem to notice anything. She didn't seem to notice me. "He's here," she whispered, barely audible again, but her lips moved, just enough that I knew she was speaking to someone or something. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, my eyes scanning the shadows. Was it just the wind? Was it just my imagination? The house creaked again, this time louder, as though something was walking slowly through the rooms above me. The air was thick now, so thick it was hard to breathe, like the walls were closing in on me. "He's waiting," Lily murmured, and for a split second, I thought I saw her eyes flicker to me. Really, see me for the first time. But then they went back to the corner, to the shadows, to the thing that was waiting. I should have called Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. I should have asked them to come home, to take me away from this house and out of this suffocating, oppressive air. But something held me in place. I heard the footsteps again, slow, heavy, deliberate. They were closer this time, just beyond the doorway, moving in the darkness. Something shifted in the hallway, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Lily, still sitting perfectly still, glanced over at me. Her lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "He's coming for you now," she whispered. And that's when I knew. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just Lily. There was something else here, something waiting, something that had always been here. I took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind me with a loud crack, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The shadows were moving. As the night dragged on, a chill settled into the house that I couldn't seem to shake. The warmth of the early evening faded, replaced by an unnerving coldness that seemed to crawl into my bones. I tried to dismiss it as a draft, but the air felt too thick, too heavy for that. It wasn't just cold, it was stifling, as if the house itself was exhaling, drawing in a breath that reverberated through the walls. The warmth of the kitchen had long since evaporated, and now I found myself shivering. Despite the layers I'd thrown on to fight the growing chill, the creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet was the only sound breaking the silence. Each step felt like an intrusion, a disruption in the oppressive quiet that had settled around me. I couldn't help but wonder if the house was alive in some way, if it was breathing, just as I was. Each time my foot touched the floor, it groaned beneath me, as though the house itself were protesting my presence. It wasn't an isolated sound. It was a constant companion, creeping along with me in every room, every hallway, always a step behind. I told myself it was nothing, just an old house, settling, stretching its bones. But the more I walked through the hallways, the more I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled, goosebumps crawling up my arms as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But no one was ever there. The rooms were empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the dim lights. But that didn't stop the gnawing feeling that something, someone, was always just out of sight, lurking in the dark corners of the house. The hallway I wandered through now felt endless, stretching before me like a tunnel. I couldn't tell if I was walking in a straight line or if the house itself was beginning to twist around me. The walls were lined with portraits, old faded family pictures that looked as though they belonged to another era. The faces were somber, their eyes seemingly following me as I passed by. I couldn't help but feel like they were judging me, like I wasn't supposed to be here. Their eyes, deep set and hollow, glared at me from their frames. The very air in this hallway felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I paused in front of one portrait in particular, the largest one hanging at the end of the hall. It was a family photo, a man, a woman, and what looked like their young child, a girl maybe a few years younger than me. The parents had a strange, stiff posture, like they were posing for something more than just a casual picture. The little girl, though, Her face seemed to be the only one with life in it. She was staring directly at the camera, her eyes wide, almost pleading. It was a subtle thing, a small tilt of her head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to communicate something. But what struck me as odd was the man. His face was scratched out, the brushstrokes so jagged that they looked almost violent, like someone had furiously attacked it. I could barely make out his features, and it was clear that this wasn't a mistake in the photograph. It was deliberate. The image of him had been intentionally defaced. The woman beside him had her eyes downcast, like she was ashamed to be near him, or perhaps mourning him. I stared at it for a moment longer than I should have, a creeping unease creeping up my spine. It was then that I realized something strange. I couldn't remember seeing this portrait when I first arrived. Had it been there? I had walked this hallway a few times past these same pictures, and yet this one hadn't registered. Had it always been here, or was it newly placed? Was I just too distracted, or was there something else going on? I couldn't remember. I didn't know. I felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder. The walls pressed in a little tighter. The silence felt less comforting now, more suffocating. I needed to get out of the hallway, needed to escape this growing feeling of dread that seemed to follow me from room to room. I turned on my heel, but as I did, I couldn't help but glance back at the portrait once more. The man's face, the one that had been so thoroughly scratched out, seemed to shift. The edges of the brush strokes began to twitch, as if something beneath the layers of paint was trying to break through. The image seemed to move, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I stared, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was I imagining things? Had the shadows played tricks on my eyes? The man's face was still barely there, but now something new appeared, something I hadn't noticed before. A faint outline, like a figure, began to emerge from the scratch marks. It was hard to make out at first, but as I blinked, the image became clearer. It was the figure of a man, or at least what was left of one. His features were twisted and blurred, but there was no mistaking the way his eyes were wide, filled with terror. I felt the bile rise in my throat. It was the same face that had been scratched out. His eyes were staring back at me, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn they were pleading. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. My breath was shallow, quick, as though I were running from something. Not just the house, but something far worse. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold biting into my skin as I stumbled through the hallway, not daring to look back at the portrait again. I found myself back in the living room, my hands trembling as I braced myself against the armrest of the couch. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get out of this house, away from whatever was happening here, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something, some force, some presence, kept me rooted to the spot. It was like the house was holding me in place, trapping me here with its oppressive weight. The silence was absolute, now almost suffocating. I glanced over at the clock on the wall. It was just after midnight. How long had I been here? It felt like hours had passed, and yet the house seemed frozen in time, as though nothing had changed. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind to the silence, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I strained to listen. "Get out!" The voice was raspy, like it came from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. It sounded like a warning, like it had been spoken through gritted teeth, carried on a gust of wind that I couldn't feel. My heart lurched in my chest, and I immediately froze, my body rigid with fear. The voice. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of the house. It was a voice. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Get out. Get out now." I spun around looking for the source of the sound, but the room was empty. No one was there. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place, before whatever was here came for me. I turned toward the front door, my feet moving on their own. But just as my hand touched the doorknob, I froze. The whisper had turned into a growl, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in my chest. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the room, and in that moment I realized something. The house wasn't letting me go. I wasn't alone. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering television screen. Lily and I sat on the old velvet couch, her small form curled up beside me, wrapped in the blanket I had tossed over her shoulders earlier. The movie was playing, but I wasn't really watching it anymore. The house felt too still, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. It had been that way all evening. Every creak, every sigh of the wind outside, every subtle movement of the shadows felt amplified in this old place. I couldn't help but feel that the house itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore the growing unease clawing at my chest, tried to focus on Lily beside me, who was sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the screen. She hadn't said much all night, and while she seemed content enough, there was something about her presence that kept me on edge. Her silence, her stillness, everything about her felt off. She was too quiet for a child, too observant. Her eyes never stayed in one place for long. They were always darting around, scanning the corners of the room, the shadows in the hallway. It was like she was waiting for something, someone. I shifted on the couch, the creaking of the worn fabric loud in the otherwise hushed atmosphere. I tried to strike up another conversation with her, something light, something normal. "So, do you like this movie?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She didn't respond immediately, which wasn't surprising. But when she did, it was in that same soft, distant voice she had been using all night. "It's not real," she said, not looking at me, her eyes still locked on the screen. "None of it is real." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. I knew she was young, but her words carried a strange weight to them, an unsettling maturity. "You mean the monsters?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. She nodded slowly, her face blank, as if she weren't fully there at all. "They're not real, but the other things are. The things in the dark." I felt a chill run through me, a sudden shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. What did she mean by that? I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could, I heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was clear enough to freeze me in place. The sound came from the hallway, just beyond the door. A low murmur, like a distant conversation, but there was no one in the hall, no one but us. Morigad and I looked over toward the darkened hallway, the shadows growing deeper in the corners. My heart began to race, a fluttering sensation in my chest that I couldn't shake. I glanced down at Lily, expecting to see her oblivious to the sound, but instead, her expression had changed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the doorway. The soft glow of the television flickered over her features, casting her in an eerie light. She was staring at the hallway, her gaze unwavering, her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, knuckles white as she slowly turned her head toward me. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it was just the house settling, just the wind creeping through the cracks in the walls. I wanted to tell her it was nothing, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to say the words. The whispering came again, this time clearer. It was a voice, low and scratchy, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Yet it felt so close, as if the person speaking was standing just behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My fingers curled into the fabric of the couch, my breath catching in my throat. Lily's grip on my arm tightened. "Don't listen," she said, her voice trembling now. "Please, don't listen." Her words sent a ripple of terror through me, though I couldn't understand why. What did she mean? Why did she sound so afraid? I turned my head slowly, instinctively looking back at the hallway, trying to make sense of the situation. The shadows seemed to shift, to pulse with a life of their own, as though something was lurking just beyond the reach of the dim light. "Lily?" My voice came out shaky, unsure. "What's going on? What do you hear?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes darted to the shadows, and she pressed herself closer to me, as though trying to hide from something only she could see. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He's Coming back. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart hammering in my chest. Who? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid to say the words out loud. But Lily didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes tightly, as if to block out the sound, her tiny body trembling against mine. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a faint murmur, but a raspy, guttural voice that sent shivers running down my spine. It sounded like it was coming from the very walls of the house, vibrating. Through the air, the voice repeated the same phrase over and over, as though trying to break through the barrier of silence that had settled over the room. Come, come, come. Each repetition was like a breath, hot and wet, pressing into my ears. I felt my stomach twist, nausea rising in my throat. The sound seemed to crawl under my skin, wrapping around my bones, suffocating me. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like something was reaching into my chest, squeezing my heart. I turned to Lily again, desperate for some kind of explanation, but she was trembling now, her face pale and wide-eyed. Her lips parted as though she was about to speak, but no words came out. She just stared at the hallway, her eyes filled with something, fear, recognition. I didn't know, but then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, but I felt it, like a change in pressure, a heavy thrum vibrating in the pit of my stomach. The whispers stopped. The stillness in the room was absolute, suffocating. Even the air felt different now, as though it had thickened, becoming dense and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. And then, a sound, a faint, scratching noise, like something scraping along the floor. It was coming from the hallway. I didn't move. I couldn't. I could only watch, helpless, as the shadows at the end of the hallway seemed to shift again, darker this time, as though something was moving toward us. The scratching grew louder, sharper, closer. Lily's eyes widened in terror, and she clutched my arm even tighter. I could feel the fear radiating off her, her tiny body trembling against mine. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the scratching sound. "He's back." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to get up, to run, but my body felt frozen in place, unable to move, like I was trapped in this suffocating moment. The scratching sound grew, louder now, accompanied by a low, wet, gurgling sound, like something, or someone, was dragging itself along the floor. The shadows moved again, coiling and twisting at the end of the hallway, as if the darkness itself was alive. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned toward Lily, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her gently. "Lily, what do you mean? What's happening? Who's coming back?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, her face pale as a sheet. She was staring at the hallway again, her mouth slightly open, as though she were trying to scream, but no sound came out. And then I saw it. A figure, darker than the shadows around it, stepped out from the darkness at the end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was obscured, shifting like smoke. It had no face, no features, just darkness, thick and suffocating, like it was swallowing the light around it. I couldn't breathe. Lily whimpered beside me, her small body trembling violently. I reached out to comfort her, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure that was slowly, relentlessly moving toward us. The whispering started again, louder this time. "Come, come, come." And as the figure drew closer, I finally understood. It wasn't asking us to come, it was demanding. And there was no way to escape. I had just finished setting up Lily's bed for the night, pulling the thick woolen blankets over her mattress when I noticed it. A doll sitting at the foot of the bed, its porcelain face turned slightly toward me. I hadn't seen it when we first arrived, but here it was now, perched there, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. It was a strange thing, old, dusty, with a cracked face and a faint, unnerving smile frozen on its lips. Its dark eyes seemed almost too real, too knowing for something made of porcelain. The way it sat there, motionless, sent a chill crawling up my spine. I paused for a moment, staring at the doll, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling it gave me. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer than they should, the pale moonlight seeping through the curtains, casting strange, twisted shapes on the walls. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I turned to Lily, who was sitting on the bed now, her legs crossed. Beneath her, watching me with that same distant, vacant expression she had worn all evening. "Lily," I said softly, my voice trembling ever so slightly. "Where did this come from? I didn't see it earlier." She didn't immediately answer. Instead, she tilted her head, the way she always did when I asked her something she didn't want to respond to, and stared at the doll with that same strange, empty gaze. Her eyes never left it. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer at all. But then, she spoke in that soft, almost monotone voice that sent a chill through me. "It's always been there," she said, her tone unnervingly flat. "Too grown up for a child her age." I stood frozen for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a weight. It didn't make sense. I'd been in this room before, and I was sure I hadn't seen the doll then. I was certain of it. But Lily's words, her unwavering certainty, made me doubt myself. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to my growing unease in this strange house, but there was something about the doll that gnawed at me, something that felt wrong. I took a step toward the bed, my feet dragging on the cold, creaky floorboards. The room was colder than it had been before, the air sharp against my skin, like a chill had settled into the walls. I reached down toward the doll, half expecting it to feel smooth and cool under my fingers, but instead, it felt almost warm. A sudden draft swept through the room, stirring the curtains at the window. I glanced over, but the window was shut tight. The room was too still, too quiet. I looked back at the doll, my fingers hovering just above it. The eyes, those glassy, lifelike eyes, seemed to watch me, unblinking. A shiver ran down my spine as I slowly reached for it. The instant my fingers made contact with the doll's porcelain skin, the temperature in the room dropped. I felt it, a sharp, biting cold that cut through the air like ice. My breath came out in a visible puff, and I pulled my hand, back instinctively, feeling a sudden sense of dread welling up in my chest. The room felt like it had just shifted, as if the air itself had thickened, the walls pressing inward with an invisible weight. Lily didn't move. She was still staring at the doll, her expression unchanged, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes never left it, as though she was waiting for something, or perhaps anticipating it. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the cold lingered, the air now thick with something that didn't belong. The shadows seemed darker somehow, deeper, stretching longer than they should. I reached for the doll again, this time determined to move it, to prove to myself that I wasn't just being paranoid. But as my fingers touched the porcelain once more, a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room. It was a sound so faint that I almost thought it was just the house settling. But it wasn't. It was wrong. Something off. The hum grew louder, a low vibrating sound that seemed to pulse in the air around me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The temperature plummeted again, the air around me growing colder with each passing second, until I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. My hands began to shake, my grip on the doll tightening involuntarily. I glanced at Lily. Her eyes were wide now, her face pale. She was no longer sitting still, her tiny hands now clutching the blankets in tight fists. But she didn't say anything. She just stared, her eyes locked on the doll, her lips pressed together in an almost unnatural stillness. Her face seemed too calm, too quiet for what was happening in the room. I pulled the doll away from the foot of the bed, my fingers trembling as I held it in my hands. The low hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. The sound was so intense, I thought my eardrums would burst. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, as I slowly began to back away from the bed, holding the doll away from me like it was something dangerous. The shadows around me seemed to shift, to stretch and twist. I could see shapes now, vague outlines that loomed just beyond my vision, shifting in the corners of the room. The air smelled musty, old, like something long forgotten. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as though the weight of the room itself was pushing me down. And then I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper just beneath the hum. But as the seconds ticked by, the whisper grew louder, clearer, until it was unmistakable. It was coming from the doll. "Put me down." The voice was low, distorted, and yet unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. The doll, held firmly in my hands, seemed to pulse with warmth, its porcelain skin smooth and unnaturally soft. The whispering continued, a steady, rhythmic voice, as if it were a part of the room itself, a presence that had been lurking in the shadows all along. "Put me down. Now." My fingers trembled, the doll slipping slightly in my hands as the voice seemed to wrap itself around me. It was both cold and hot at the same time, an eerie contrast that made my skin crawl. My heart raced, my pulse thundering in my ears as I stood there, unable to move. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing darker, colder. The voice was all around me now, echoing in the corners of the room, whispering, calling, urging me to do something I couldn't explain. I didn't want to listen to it. I didn't want to obey, but I couldn't help it. The voice was too powerful, too insistent. My fingers, almost on their own, slowly lowered the doll back to the foot of the bed, and as soon as it made contact with the blanket, the room went deathly silent. The hum stopped. The air grew still. The shadows seemed to recede. But Lily, she didn't look at me. She didn't move. She didn't say anything. She simply stared at the doll, her wide eyes filled with something I couldn't place. The moment the doll was back in its spot, the temperature in the room lifted, though it didn't feel quite the same. The chill that had pressed against my skin had lessened, but the unease remained, like an invisible weight that hung heavy in the air. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I had to get out of this room, out of this house, but I didn't know if I was even capable of moving. Lily slowly turned her head to look at me, and her lips curled into a smile. But it wasn't a smile of comfort. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something darker, something that sent a cold shiver through my body. "It's happy now," she whispered, her voice soft, almost sing-song. "It's waiting for you." And in that moment, I realized that the doll wasn't just waiting for me. It had been waiting for all of us. I had been pacing the house for what felt like hours, my mind running in circles. The air in this place was thick, and the weight of it seemed to press down on me with every step I took. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the old house made my heart race. The silence was suffocating. Lily had barely spoken since dinner, and the oppressive quiet made the house feel even more haunted, as if it were holding its breath. I needed a break, something to take my mind off the unease that seemed to grow with each passing minute. I'd explored the kitchen, the living room, even the study, but the house felt like it was stretching on forever. The rooms felt like they blended into one another, and none of them seemed to offer the escape I was searching for. I turned a corner in the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the walls, and that's when I saw it, a door at the end of the corridor. It was old, heavy wood with peeling paint, and it looked out of place among the rest of the rooms. In the house, I hadn't noticed it earlier. I couldn't recall walking past it. My pulse quickened as I walked toward it. It was as if the house had been hiding it from me until now. At first I assumed it was a closet, one of those small, forgotten spaces tucked away in older houses, but there was something about it that felt different. It felt like it was more than just a closet, as though it was holding something back. My curiosity got the better of me. The handle was cold beneath my fingers as I turned it. The door didn't open. I tried again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The old lock on the door seemed to mock me, as though it had been waiting for someone to come and try it. I could almost hear the house creaking with disappointment as if it had been expecting me to give up, to walk away. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. There was something about that door, something that called to me, urging me to understand what lay beyond it. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening for any sounds that might give me a clue as to what was inside. There was nothing, just silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, suffocating, and unnatural. I pulled back, my breath catching in my throat as I studied the door once more. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if it was watching me back. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in the atmosphere, like the house was holding its breath again. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a wave of unease washed over me. I took a step back, wondering why this door, of all things, was making me feel this way. What could possibly be behind it? Before I could think further, I heard them. Soft, deliberate footsteps, light but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to turn, but I resisted, fighting the urge to whip around too quickly. I didn't want to be caught off guard. Not here. Not in this house. The footsteps grew louder, closer now. They sounded small, like the footfalls of a child, but there was something about them that made me uneasy. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I had to know. I turned, and there she was, Lily, standing in the hallway just a few feet behind me. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something dark, something I couldn't place. Her gaze was locked on the door, her body stiff as though she was waiting for me to speak, to ask her what she was doing there. Her hair, normally neat and tidy, hung loosely around her face. She looked small, fragile, and somehow older than she had before. It was like the shadows had gathered around her, sinking into her skin, pressing her deeper into the world of this house. "You shouldn't go in there," she whispered, her voice so soft it almost sounded like she was speaking to herself, but the words were clear enough. "He doesn't like it." The hairs on the back of my neck prickled again, this time with a sharp sense of fear. "Who doesn't like it?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow, empty. Lily didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed locked on the door, her mouth pressed into a thin line. There was something in her eyes, something I couldn't understand. Her fingers twitched at her sides as if she was about to say more but couldn't. I felt a cold chill wash over me, creeping up, from the floorboards and into my legs, numbing them with its icy touch. He's not like the others," Lily continued, her voice lower now, as if she were afraid to speak the words out loud. "He's not like anyone else." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My pulse quickened again, racing in my chest like a drumbeat, each thump louder than the last. The door felt even colder now, its presence looming larger in the narrow hallway. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow alive, that it was waiting for something, something only I could provide. Only I was meant to know. But the idea that Lily was scared, genuinely terrified, made my skin crawl. She wasn't just a scared child. No, this was something else. I looked at her, trying to gauge her reaction. There was no fear in her eyes, not in the way I had expected. It wasn't the kind of fear that made you cry or scream. It was something more subtle, something quiet, like the terror of someone who had seen something they couldn't forget, something they couldn't undo. "Lily, what are you talking about?" I asked, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what she meant. "Who's behind that door?" She didn't respond. Instead, she took a step back, her eyes still locked on the door as though it were calling her, pulling her toward it. The air around us felt thicker now, colder, heavier. It was like the space between us and the door had become something else, something more. Sinister. Lily's voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have tried the door," she said, her words almost drowned by the creaking of the floor beneath us. "He's waiting for you." My stomach twisted. A cold sweat broke out on my brow. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond to something so strange, so inexplicable. Who was she talking about? What was behind that door? And then, without warning, the sound came again. The soft, deliberate footsteps. But this time, they were not just behind me. They were inside the house, inside the walls. I could feel them, echoing through the floorboards beneath my feet. A dragging sound, slow, deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the house with purpose. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to look at Lily, desperate for some kind of explanation, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the door, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open as if she was waiting for something to happen. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The house seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting. And then I heard it, just above the soft whispering of the footsteps, a low, rumbling growl. It was deep, guttural, vibrating through the walls. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound alive. I stepped back, my feet heavy on the floor, my hands shaking. "Lily, what is that? What's happening?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. She just stood there, her face pale and drawn, her expression frozen in place. And then from the dark corner of the hallway, something moved, something huge, something alive. It emerged from the shadows, impossibly tall, its outline just barely visible in the dim light. It moved closer, slowly, almost deliberately, dragging itself toward us, toward the door. Lily's voice broke the silence, but this time it was sharp, a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. "He's here," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "He's coming for you." I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the shape that was creeping toward us, its movement slow, deliberate, and filled with an eerie, predatory patience. And then, just before it reached the door, everything went silent. The figure stopped. I stood frozen, unable to breathe, my mind racing with confusion and fear. What was it? What was happening? And then, just as suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. The lock had fallen. The house was waiting. The evening stretched on, the house growing quieter as the hours passed. The oppressive silence hung heavily in the air, thickening the atmosphere until it felt like even the walls were holding their breath. I had tried to relax after the unsettling encounter with Lily earlier, but the unease I had felt all night seemed to settle deeper into my bones. The house was a labyrinth of shadows, each room darker than the last, each corner seeming to whisper secrets I wasn't supposed to know. I found myself drawn back to the hallway, the same hallway that had felt so cold earlier. There was something about it, a pull, like it was calling to me, urging me to investigate, to understand what I had seen. My feet moved of their own accord, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the door again, the locked door at the end of the hall. I didn't dare touch it again, but the feeling of that door, of what lay beyond it, stayed with me. I felt like I was being watched, though when I turned, no one was there. The house was as empty as it had been all evening. Still, the oppressive air weighed on me. I stepped backward, instinctively glancing at the window at the end of the hallway, the one that overlooked the front yard. The glass was dirty, streaked with grime and years of neglect. Through it, I could see nothing but the dark outline of the trees outside, swaying in the wind. The porch light was on, casting an orange glow on the overgrown yard, but the rest of the world beyond the window was swallowed by darkness. The wind had picked up, making the branches creak and groan as they scraped against the house. I stood there staring at the window, lost in my thoughts, when something caught my eye, a shadow. At first I thought it was the movement of the trees or the shift of light as the wind played with the branches. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, a dark shape standing just beyond the glass. I froze. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, standing motionless in the yard. I could barely make out any details, but I could tell it was watching me, staring into the house with an unsettling stillness. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was like the figure knew I was watching, as if it was aware of my every movement. I wanted to look away, to move, but I couldn't. My body felt paralyzed, my legs like stone beneath me. The figure didn't move. Not an inch, but I felt its presence, thick and heavy, pressing against the glass. The cold seeped through the window, creeping into the very air around me. Then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. It raised its hand, palm flat against the glass, as if it were trying to touch me, to reach through the window. I couldn't breathe, couldn't tear my eyes away from the image. It was impossible to look at, yet impossible to ignore. The hand was huge, its fingers long and unnatural, stretching across the window like a shadow of something not entirely human. I felt the chill in the air intensify, crawling under my skin, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My mouth went dry, and I swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. But even as I told myself this, a voice inside whispered that it wasn't, that whatever this thing was, it was real. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure lowered its hand and stepped back into the darkness. I blinked, staring at the empty yard, but it was gone. The shadow was no longer there, and the window reflected nothing but the swaying branches and the faint orange glow from the porch light. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart racing. I felt a deep, instinctive dread crawl up my spine, but I couldn't look away from the window. I couldn't move. That's when I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, my body jerking with shock. Standing just behind me in the hallway was Lily, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale under the dim light. She was staring at the window, her body rigid, her fingers clenched at her sides. The soft sound of her breathing was the only thing breaking the stillness, and her presence sent a fresh wave of fear flooding through me. "That's him," Lily whispered, her voice low and trembling. Her words seemed to echo in the empty hallway, bouncing off the walls and vibrating in the pit of my stomach. "He's watching." I felt the blood drain from my face, my stomach twisting with a sickening jolt. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak. All I could do was look at her, her wide eyes still locked on the empty window, her expression frozen in fear. The fear in her eyes was not the innocent kind a child should have. It was something older, something far darker. You saw him too?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding small and weak in the heavy silence of the house. Lily nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the window. "He's always there," she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "He watches the house, watches us, but we're not supposed to look at him. If you look, he knows." The air seemed to grow colder still, the temperature in the hallway dropping even further. I felt a deep, gnawing sense of dread, a hollow emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the walls. The idea that Lily had seen this figure before, had known about it, made my chest tighten. How long had she been living? In this house with this thing outside staring in? How had she been able to bear it? I tried to steady my breath, but it came out in shaky bursts. "What do you mean he knows?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Lily turned her head slowly to face me, her eyes empty and wide, too wide for a child. "If you see him, you belong to him," she said softly, her words as cold as the air around us. "He comes for you then. He'll take you." I didn't want to hear any more. I wanted to tell Lily it was all in her head, that she had imagined it, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't lying. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me like a physical force. And then, just as I was about to open my mouth to ask her more, the house groaned. The floorboards creaked, a low, guttural sound, like something, or someone, was moving beneath us. The fear in Lily's eyes grew, and she took a step back, pressing her small body against the wall, her hands shaking. "He's here," she whispered. "He's coming." A cold, ominous chill swept through the hallway, and I could feel the weight of something in the air, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I turned toward the window again, my heart hammering in my chest. But the yard outside was empty. No figure stood in the shadows, no hand pressed against the glass. And yet, I knew he was there. I could feel him. I could feel his presence outside, watching, waiting. The very air seemed to hum with his energy, like the tension before a storm. Lily took another step back, her feet sliding quietly against the floor as she moved toward the far wall, away from the window. Her eyes never left it, as if she feared looking away would make the figure appear again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to think. Was it really happening? Was this some twisted figment of my imagination? Or had the house truly come alive in some way, its shadows crawling with things I couldn't understand? I have to leave, I whispered to myself, my feet already taking the first tentative steps toward the door. But Lily's voice stopped me. You can't leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it made my skin crawl. He won't let you. I froze in place, unable to move. I felt as if the walls were closing in on me, as if the house was shrinking, trapping me here with whatever was out there, in the darkness, in the cold. I turned back to the window, once more, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shifting shadows of the night. But even as I told myself there was no one there, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone, and whatever it was waiting. The house had been eerily quiet for hours, the only sound the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere in the distance. The unsettling stillness had settled in like a fog, thick and suffocating, making it difficult to think clearly. I had been sitting in the living room trying to distract myself from the creeping dread that gnawed at me. But it was impossible. Every shadow seemed to loom just a little too long. Every creak of the floorboards echoed too loudly. Even the air felt different. Here, heavy and stagnant, as if the house had taken on a life of its own. Lily had gone to bed not long before, though she had barely spoken to me since our conversation in the hallway. I'd tried to get her to talk, to ask her more about the strange things she had said, but she had only given me those distant, vacant looks, and then retreated into her room. It seemed as though she was trying to escape something, but I couldn't figure out what. The silence between us felt like a chasm. I hadn't meant to doze off. I hadn't meant to fall into a light, restless sleep on the couch. But I must have. I don't know how long I had been out, but something jolted me awake, something that wasn't the faint creak of the house or the sigh of the wind outside. It was a scream. It pierced through the silence like a knife, sharp, shrill, and full of terror. My heart leapt in my chest as I scrambled to sit up, my mind still foggy with sleep. I was disoriented, my eyes wide as I tried to locate the source of the scream. It wasn't just a scream, though. It was the kind of scream that made your blood run cold, the kind that sent a chill racing down your spine and made every hair on your body stand at attention. It was a cry of pure, unadulterated fear. Lily. I jumped to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, the world spinning around me as I rushed toward the hallway. The scream had come from her room. There was no mistaking it. The sound had been too frantic, too desperate. But as I reached her door and pushed it open, a strange silence greeted me. The room was dark, the faintest moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the walls. Lily was standing in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall, her hands clutching her head as if she were trying to block something out. Her body was trembling violently, her breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. Her eyes were wide with terror, pupils blown, as though she had seen something that had shattered her reality. I called her name, but she didn't respond. She only stared ahead, unblinking, her body shaking with fear. "Lily," I said again, softer this time, my voice trembling with concern. "What's wrong? What happened?" She didn't answer. Instead, she let out a low, guttural moan, like she was in pain, her hands tightening around her head. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were trying to see something I couldn't. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she mumbled, something that sent ice through my veins. "The man, he's coming back." I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. "What man?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had to ask. I had to hear her say it. But Lily didn't answer. She only stared, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name, something that filled me with a deep, cold dread. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the far end of the hallway, a noise so violent it shook the walls like something had slammed into the door at the end of the hall. It was followed by a guttural growl, low, deep, and vibrating through my bones. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a raw, primal noise that seemed to crawl up from the very depths of the earth. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of dread. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew this wasn't something I was prepared to face. The door at the end of the hall, the locked door, began to rattle. Slowly at first, then harder, like something on the other side was trying to break through. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my hands trembling at my sides. "Lily, what is that? What's happening?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw a flicker of recognition, real fear in them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she looked toward the hallway, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes, something that made my stomach turn. The rattle of the door grew louder, more frantic, and then the growl came again. This time it was closer, much closer. I turned toward the door, my legs heavy, my body frozen in place, as the sound of someone, shifting in the shadows grew louder. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the stillness of the house. The temperature in the room dropped, a cold so intense it felt like ice was seeping through the floorboards, wrapping itself around my ankles. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and broad, moved just beyond the door, flickering in and out of the dim light. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. It was there, right behind the door, waiting. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I could feel the pressure of it in my chest, like something was trying to crush me from all sides. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. Lily's voice cut through the silence, soft but filled with a desperate urgency. "He's coming for you." Her words were barely a whisper, but they were enough to make my blood run cold. I looked back at her, her face pale, her hands still pressed tightly against her head, as if she were trying to block out whatever was happening, but there was no blocking it. The sounds from the other side of the door were growing louder, more frantic. The door itself was shaking, its wooden frame creaking under the strain. I backed away slowly, my feet heavy as I moved toward the corner of the room. The shadow moved again, and then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, slow, dragging footsteps from behind the door. My entire body went rigid as the sound came closer, closer, until it was right on the other side. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to hold it in, praying that whatever was on the other side wouldn't hear me. But the door creaked as the lock rattled again, the sound grating against my nerves. The figure was right there on the other side. I could feel it, like it was just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I turned back to Lily, but she was no longer staring at the door. Her gaze had shifted, and her eyes locked onto something just behind me. The air around us was so thick I could barely breathe. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said one last thing. "It's here." Before I could turn around, I felt a cold hand press against my shoulder. The touch was ice, cold, unfeeling. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing. Only the oppressive darkness of the hallway stretching out before me. The door rattled again, harder this time, and just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw it, just for a brief moment. A figure standing in the shadows, watching me. Its eyes were empty, hollow black pits, like there was nothing behind them. But it was staring at me, and in that instant, I knew. It wasn't the door that was locked. It was me. I don't know what made me decide to leave. Maybe it was the oppressive silence that had settled over the house, or the constant feeling that I wasn't alone. Maybe it was the growl, the rattling door, or Lily's trembling words. But whatever it was, I could no longer stay in this place. I couldn't stand the suffocating air, the gnawing dread that pressed against my chest. like the house itself was trying to crush me from the inside out. I grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her close to me, my mind racing. I had to get us out of here. There was no time to question what was happening, no time to understand it. All I could think of was the need to leave, to run, to escape before whatever was in this house reached out and pulled us under. "We're leaving," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to go now." But when I turned to grab my purse from the table by the door, she was gone. My heart skipped a beat. The room felt suddenly vast, empty, and cold. I spun around, calling her name, my voice cracking as I tried to steady my breath. "Lily! Lily!" There was no answer, no soft shuffle of feet, no distant rustle of her clothes, nothing but the unsettling silence that had grown even thicker in her absence. The air, once heavy and cold, now felt suffocating, thick with something unseen. Something wrong. I could feel the walls closing in, pressing against my chest, and I fought against the rising panic threatening to swallow me whole. I called her name again, louder this time. "Lily!" My voice echoed down the hallway, but there was no response. The house stood still, unmoving. No creak of the floorboards, no wind in the windows. Nothing. Only the silence. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting, watching. I moved quickly, turning to the rooms one by one, searching through the house, praying that I would find her. My footsteps echoed unnervingly as I moved through the darkened hallway. The walls, thick with age and dust, seemed to narrow around me, trapping me in this space where time felt suspended. I called her name again, my voice a frantic whisper in the quiet. "Lily!" The house didn't answer. It never did. I checked every room, the bathroom, the study, even the attic, though I had no real reason to believe she was up there. I didn't stop searching, not for a second. I had to find her. I had to. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. The house was changing, shifting around me. The walls felt different now, like they were alive, like they were pressing in, twisting in on themselves as if the house didn't want me to leave. But Lily wasn't in any of the rooms. She was nowhere to be found. I felt my stomach twist into knots, the panic rising like a flood. I was standing in the middle of the living room now, hands shaking at my sides, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My pulse thrummed in my ears, drowning out the silence that surrounded me. The house felt so much bigger now, stretching endlessly in every direction, its cold breath brushing against my skin like something alive. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to steady myself, but it was no use. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something was waiting. I moved toward the hallway, hoping to check one last time when I stopped. Something caught my eye. The family portrait, the one I had seen earlier, the one with the scratched-out face of the father. I hadn't thought much of it before, too distracted by everything else that had been happening. But now something was different. The painting was different. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I took a hesitant step forward. The image of the father, whose face had been marred by violent streaks of paint, scratched out in some frantic rage, was suddenly clear. His face was now visible, but something was wrong. His eyes, which had once been obscured by those hasty strokes, were now black, empty voids. There were no pupils, no irises, just two wide, gaping holes staring back at me, like endless pits of darkness that seemed to pull at my soul. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I stared at the portrait. I couldn't look away. It was as though the eyes of the father were drawing me in, suffocating me with their emptiness. The silence in the room was unbearable, the air thick with the sense that something was waiting for me to make the next move, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I blinked, trying to shake myself out of the trance that had taken hold of me. But when I opened my eyes again, something had changed. Something in the portrait had shifted, just barely visible, lurking in the background. A shadow. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, just a shifting movement in the dark corner behind the father. But as I leaned in closer, the shadow grew more distinct, more solid. It was tall, dark and indistinct, standing just beyond the father, barely perceptible except for the way it seemed to move in the background. It was like it was watching me, just like the father, its presence suffocating and oppressive. My body went cold. I stepped back, my breath quickening, the room spinning around me. I stumbled, disoriented, and slammed into the wall behind me. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But when I looked back at the portrait, the shadow was still there. It had grown slightly larger, darker, more defined. It was there, in the background watching. I turned, my heart thudding in my chest, and I sprinted down the hallway, desperately searching for any sign of Lily. The house seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the shadows growing longer, swallowing up the light. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own feet pounding against the floor. I checked the rooms again, each one more frantic than the last. My thoughts raced. Where could she have gone? Where is she? The house seemed to grow darker with every passing moment. The walls closed in, on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't understand what was happening. Where is she? And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The shadow. It was in the hallway just beyond the door to the locked room. It was tall now, taller than before, its form barely visible in the flickering light. It was standing there just beyond the door, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I bolted, rushing toward the door, my hand gripping the handle. But as I reached for it, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned, panic flooding my veins. There, standing in the doorway, was Lily. But she wasn't the same. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, as though she had been drained of everything that made her human. She wasn't speaking. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to freeze me in place. She stood there, her hand raised, pointing toward the dark figure that still lingered in the shadows of the hallway. And then she whispered, her voice flat, emotionless. "He's here." The air around us grew thick, and I felt the floor beneath me tremble. The house seemed to come alive, the walls groaning, the shadows stretching. The figure in the doorway moved closer, its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked on me. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the doorway, staring at the empty hallway, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. The last few moments felt like a dream, a blur of panic and confusion. I had grabbed Lily, intending to flee the house, but when I turned back to grab my purse, she was gone. Completely gone. The house was eerily silent. Too silent. I called her name, my voice breaking, but there was no answer. The oppressive stillness of the house seemed to mock me, each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet amplifying the tension in the air. I could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had to leave. I had to get out. But when I rushed out the door, it wasn't just the house that haunted me. It was the thought of Lily. Where could she have gone? She had been here just moments before. The suddenness of her disappearance, the complete absence of any explanation, was maddening. It gnawed at my mind, the question repeating like a chant. What happened? I had barely made it to the front yard when I fumbled for my phone, dialing the police with shaky fingers. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The moment I spoke to the operator, I broke down. I couldn't keep it together anymore. I had to tell them everything. Lily's strange behavior, the things she had said, the terrifying presence that felt like it was suffocating me. I told them about the locked door, the strange noises, the shadow in the window. I told them about the father's face in the portrait, the figure standing behind him, and the terror that had followed me through every room. The police arrived quickly. They searched the house from top to bottom, combing through each room, opening closets, pulling back curtains, tearing up floorboards. They checked every inch, but there was no sign of Lily. No sign of Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, either. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The only thing that remained was the oppressive silence of the house and a growing sense of dread that clung to the air like fog. I tried to explain to the officers, but nothing I said seemed to make sense. "This house is haunted," I said, but the words felt ridiculous, even to me. They exchanged skeptical glances, treating me like a frightened teenager caught in a bad dream. They promised to keep searching, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't convinced. Eventually, the search was called off. The authorities came to the conclusion that there was no evidence of foul play. The house was simply abandoned. The Caldwells had vanished, and no one knew where they'd gone. The police filed a report, and that was it. The house stood empty, locked and silent, like a tomb. No one spoke of it again. Not to me, not to anyone. They assumed it was just a strange case, another unsolved mystery to be buried in the past. But that didn't sit right with me. There was something more to it, something that I couldn't shake, something in the air, in the walls, in the very bones of that house. It was like I had walked into a nightmare and never fully escaped. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I went through the motions, pretending that I was fine, that the house had been nothing more than a twisted figment of my imagination. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't forget the feeling of Lily's trembling hand in mine, her terrified eyes, the whispers that echoed in my mind, and the cold emptiness of the house that had swallowed her whole. Then one day, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was all over, I received a voicemail. I don't know why I even picked up my phone. It was late, too late, and I had been lying in bed, my mind restless as it often was. I had almost drifted off to sleep when the notification pinged, a voicemail from an unknown number. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the play button. I should have ignored it, should have just put the phone down and tried to sleep. But something inside me urged me to listen. A part of me wanted answers. I pressed play. At first there was nothing, just a crackling silence, as if the call had dropped. But then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me," it whispered, and I could barely hear it over the static. "He's coming for you." The voice was unmistakable. It was Lily's voice. I felt my heart stop in my chest. My hands clenched the phone so tightly I thought I might crush it. Her voice sounded distant, like she was speaking from a faraway place, trapped behind layers of something thick and suffocating. It was as if she were calling from some dark, unreachable place, far beyond the walls of reality. The words were broken, fragmented, like she was struggling to say them, fighting against something that was pulling her away. "Lily?" I whispered into the phone, my voice shaking. My mind was racing, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. But the phone had gone silent. The call had ended. I called back immediately, but there was no answer. The number didn't even exist. I tried not to panic. I told myself it was just a glitch, a trick of the mind. The voice wasn't real, but deep down I knew it was. I knew it had been Lily. I knew the words had been a warning, and the dread, the gnawing terror that had taken root in me that night, when the house had swallowed her whole, returned with a vengeance. It wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing, choking, until I could hardly breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay awake in the dark, the words echoing in my head. "He's coming for you next." Over and over, a warning, a promise. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. It wasn't just the memory of the house. It wasn't just the unanswered questions. It was a presence, something I couldn't see but could feel, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, hiding in the shadows. I began to hear noises again, footsteps outside my apartment when no one was there, scratching at my windows in the middle of the night, and always the distant sound of whispering, like a voice just barely audible, calling my name. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the neighbors, it was something else, something that had followed me from that house. And then one morning I woke up to find something on my doorstep, a small porcelain doll. It was the same one I had seen in Lily's room, sitting innocently at the foot of her bed. The same one I had tried to ignore, the same one that had chilled my blood. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to gleam in the morning light, staring directly at me, And beneath it, written in smudged ink, were two words. He's here. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. The doll was cold to the touch, as if it had been sitting outside for hours, maybe days. I dropped it to the ground, my hands shaking, my heart racing. I backed away slowly, fear crawling up my spine. I never went back to that house. I couldn't, but I also couldn't escape it. The whispers, the presence, the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me. It followed me, no matter how far I ran. And now, as I sit here, the echo of that voice still haunting me, I know one thing for certain. Lily was right. The man is coming, and I don't think there's anywhere left to run.